Hi, and thanks everyone for coming. So our panel is going to be covering a broad range of areas, all pertaining to this world in crisis and how we can build supply chain resilience. And that covers an awful lot of areas. So we're very fortunate to have two great panelists on here. We've got Edna Conway, CEO of EMC Advisory, board director, former chief security and risk officer at MS Cloud, and CSO Global Value Chain. And then on her right is Aaron Zhou, senior executive cybersecurity, Office of the CISO, Google Cloud, former SVP Mandiant for strategy and alliances, and retired FBI senior cyber executive. And what I'm going to do is just to kick it off a little bit is to walk through what we really even mean by a world in crisis. And it could mean a lot of things. And when we're specifically talking about supply chain resilience and building up greater collective resilience, collaboration, hardening our systems across our entire supply chain, we have to think about the really broad shifts that are going on across the international system right now. Now, for the most part, I look at 2020 as a very big inflection point in the world system. There were a lot of trends underway prior to 2020, but going forward, the pandemic really was a break point between the previous world order and what we're seeing starting to emerge as the post-pandemic world order. And what we're seeing in that is that black swans no longer exist. These crises that we thought were once in 100 years really are starting to occur more frequently. And it means everything from the geopolitical shift that is underway and that's transforming our global supply chains. And that's a component that we may not think about in cybersecurity, what those implications may be for a globalization that is transforming and starting to evolve in new ways. But it's essential when you think about the components that are underway. On the geopolitical stance, a lot of that is manifesting in geoeconomic statecraft. That's putting a lot of the software and hardware companies in companies' IT stack now on sanctions or restrictions lists because they're linked to security concerns in Russia or China, Iran, North Korea, several other countries. And so that introduces a new risk going on. On top of that, we're looking at supply chain attacks increasing by some stances 600% year over year. They've now surpassed malware and data compromises. And so supply chain attacks really are becoming a new way to access into companies, and maybe reasons for certain companies have really been able to harden themselves, and it becomes an easier way to come in. But at the end of the day, the globalization that has led to so much interdependence also has become a way to access data and insert compromises. And on top of all that, we also have the climate shifts that are underway that are putting some of the infrastructure and data centers at risk as well. And so those are just some of the core characteristics of what this new normal is looking like. And so we'll be talking about different ways to build resilience in this new normal, preparing really towards operational resilience to help mitigate against these range of disruptions that were previously thought of as very rare events that are becoming more and more frequent. And the concern over this is starting to pop up even more. We see that in the US at least, we're seeing a shifting in attitude, really elevating cyber attacks as one of the major concerns for disruptions. And that has surpassed other areas such as nuclear concerns. And this is one of the first years that we've seen it, and those are two different surveys up there that both come to very similar concerns in highlighting the growing emphasis on cyber attacks and concerns of what a really malicious cyber attack might do to our public goods, the social systems, and as well as our national security and economic security. And so within that backdrop of all sorts of great things that are going on in the world, one of the things I wanted to pass on and start talking to our panelists about is that given all of this, we're still at a point where much of the basic cyber hygiene still isn't being taken into consideration. But we're not going to focus on that. There are plenty of panels around and discussion presentations to talk about building out your own cyber hygiene and that foundation. What I'd like to ask next is, so given the aspects of cyber hygiene, what are the demands and concerns that you're seeing, Aaron, beyond those foundational aspects that we know are so important?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to start by saying that when you have a background like mine, guess what you get to do? You get to start with legal disclaimers. So very quickly, yes, I used to be part of the government, but anything I'm offering now is just my personal opinion and not that of the US government. And I do think it's important, though. This one I actually appreciate. It's that whether I was in government or private sector, we protect victims and we protect our clients. So if I mention a particular set of circumstances, it's because I have permission to do so. And I think that's important because when you hear people up here or across conferences or around the world and you hear them talking about different activities, you don't want to feel like that might be you being talked about someday. And it won't be because we get permission to do that. And then the last thing is, if I talk about Russia, China, North Korea, et cetera, those are nation-state actors or nation-state nexus actors that we're talking about, but not the people from there. And I want to be really respectful and thoughtful about letting you know that. So with that, I do want to share what we're seeing as far as just what are those top perspectives. And right now, Mandiant is tracking over 3,500 threat actor groups. And of those, 900 were newly identified last year alone. Of the over 580 different types of new malware families we identified last year, most of those were being used to establish backdoors, right? So that's a sophisticated technique. It's telling you that the threat actors care about persistent access and they're working toward it, and it tells you that there are many threat actors who are engaged in this activity. So how are you being attacked? You mentioned it, right? Exploits. We know that our data is a little bit skewed because we're in some of the largest attacks around the world. But for us, we are seeing that exploits are the #1 attack vector. So that means we have to think about 0 days. And last year, we discovered over 50 being used in the attack lifecycle. The year before that was over 80 new 0 days being used in the attack lifecycle, which was more than the previous 3 years combined. Obviously, when you have 0 days, you're worried about end days, because once we discover them, until the time we patch them, it's a race. And oftentimes the threat actors are winning that race, and we've seen threat actors like those from China being able to exploit end days in as soon as about 24 hours from the time that it hits the public media. The other ways that we're seeing the attacks are still phishing. It's #2 for us, but around the world, we still think phishing is probably the #1. So it's probably more common than the exploits, but for the ones we see, it's just a little different lens that we look at. The other areas of common initial access are stolen credentials, the use of a prior compromise, and getting infected from going to websites. And some of those are within your control to help improve your defenses against, and some of them are really not. So we'll talk about different ways to approach that, but that's what's happening. And because of so many of these issues and problems being in the supply chain, not necessarily things that you're letting come in, it's no surprise that 63% of the attacks that we saw last year, people were notified from an external source rather than detecting it themselves. Now, our dwell time is still low, so we're doing really well, and we're responding really quickly, and I actually think defenses are getting better, but the fact that these are in the supply chain means that there are a lot of things that are not necessarily in your direct control that contribute to you needing others and you having to pay attention and work with others in order to be able to identify these things early. And then what's new? Well, exactly what we're here to talk about. It's the one-to-many attack types. So we saw a lot of the software being compromised, including security software. We see update processes being compromised. We see the things that people use most being something that the attackers go after most now. So that means that recently, communications, right? We saw 3CX come out with information about a breach. Mandiant blogged on it. If you want to learn more, go ahead and look at the website. But the reason I want to mention it is because it's a little different than things we've seen before, because it was someone in their supply chain that had a compromise, then they were infected, and then now the infection goes on. So it's a different way of spreading than what we've seen before. We've seen virtual machines compromised, VPNs compromised. I mean, these are things that we tell you to do for security purposes. So of course the threat actors wanted to find out, how can I thwart those efforts and how do I get into those? Open source code, of course, with Log4j was a big one. I'm sure many in this room had to work on issues with that, and like I said, compromised websites. And then finally, we've seen a lot more attention being placed by our threat actors on routers and firewalls. I mean, even recently, even inside our company, we had a conversation about, do we now need firewalls for our firewalls? The things we use for security and the things we use most in our lives are the things that the threat actors care a lot about. So what else is new? In most of the attacks we saw, actually 40% of the attacks we saw last year, the threat actors prioritized data theft. So data is king. And this is something that we have to really come to terms with. Not only protecting what you consider to be your crown jewels because it's essential for your business, like your IP or other functions, but also the type of data that the threat actors care about. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. The two last things I want to mention about what's new. One is we've been worrying about this and now we're actually seeing it. Threat actors are not just disrupting your activities with their attacks, but they're also doing a secondary type of attack where they thwart your recovery efforts as well. So now your recovery might take longer, it might be more challenging for you, it might go on for a period of time where you discover more things that thwart your recovery efforts. So things might not go smoothly as you've been planning, even if you are well prepared. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that in over a quarter of our investigations, we're finding now more threat actors, multiple threat actors in single victim environments. So that means if you find one compromise, you need to keep looking for others. And that, to me, all of these things that I just kind of gave you the rundown of what the environment looks like tells me our topic is something we need to be talking about because nobody can do this alone, and this is the new normal, and it's different than what we've seen before.
You know, so to your last point, it almost reminds me of a comment I heard that a company basically were told they found the United Nations within their system with so many different government represented groups in there.
That's right.
Hey, Andrea, let me add one thing that I'm seeing. You know, we've all gone to the cloud to some degree, some large percentages, some smaller percentages. I think there's an area that we haven't been focused on as much as we should, and there are companies out there doing great work in this. The browser is the gateway to the cloud. So we've been talking about firewalls, we've been talking about containers, we've been talking about SOCs and SIEMs and SASE, and we need to be talking about the reality of the browser as the beautiful open door through which you experience the digital environment and particularly access to the cloud environment. So browser security is another one that we've seen coming up, particularly when you're working with suppliers where you have to share information on a VM.
And I forgot to mention how readily used stolen credentials are, and a lot of that can be held in your browser. So you're absolutely right.
All right, so given that bleak overview, what are you seeing as far as the shifts that organizations are making to help both harden their software supply chain and data security across their extended ecosystem?
You asking me that one?
I am.
Okie dokie. So a couple of things, right? I think some of it sounds like basic hygiene, but the way in which we actually deploy secure development life cycles is changing. And the way we actually look at something that Erin pointed out, which you've got the browser as the gateway, but the key to everything in the digital environment is identity and access management. Let's be honest, right? It is today, it was before, it's going to continue to be. So given that, what I think we're seeing is a little bit of a difference in how we approach sharing in an agile environment, because there's an open door, and then there's, can we create groups of developers that actually partner on segments? And more importantly, when you start to embrace the third-party ecosystem, right? So last time I looked, you still need tools in order to enable chip capabilities. There's only a couple of companies out there that are in all the supply chains for the chip providers. And let's remember the chips are, in effect, the brain of any printed circuit board device, right, an assembly. And none of what we have works. So software doesn't exist alone. So what I'm seeing is folks start to create, everybody has a different word, I'll use pods, mostly because I just like whales. But the reality is, that's something that we need to think about. We went to this open aperture, and we need to say it's open, but it's open in a community that needs to have access. And the concern I've seen is we're using third parties more and more. God help us, we're also using open source software more and more. So what are we doing to test? How often are we doing the testing? And then more importantly, are we doing run testing in controlled environments? So I'm seeing a lot more of that, right? You would see releases for private preview or public preview or announcements that said, you know, we're putting this out for beta. When you see the B word, there's one word you should remember, which is beware. And so you can test it, but do it in a controlled environment. And so those are some of the things that I'm seeing. The other thing is, you know, for those of us who have been thinking about that third-party ecosystem for more decades than I'm willing to admit on this stage, the reality is you need to know who you're working with and what they're doing. And you don't need to know it just at one tier. You need to know it at 10 tiers. You're never going to do that alone. You need to have a partner who's giving you that visibility, and it's multiple partners, and there are companies out there, Andrea happens to work for one, that are giving us some of that insight. But Erin said something that's really important, which is we can't do it alone. So what are you doing with those third parties? Lots of us have started deploying, and some of us a couple of decades ago now, what we would call security and risk architectures. So they are a set of, in order to play in this sandbox, you need to at least be able to do this. And oh, by the way, I want empirical data to support that you can do this and are doing it sustainably. And that's got to be something beyond questionnaires. It's got to be something that allows you to get access to the empirical data, to look at your third-party ecosystem and say, I'm going to protect that data on your behalf, because many of them may be reticent to share it. It requires that you look at some of the international certifications that so many of us as companies and as products have gone out of our way to seek to be certified under, because we believe they are meaningful. And so mapping those certifications against here's what you need to play is important. And then the last piece is have a risk prioritization. So for years I've been saying security folks need to actually speak the language of business, lead with the language of business. How long have we been in a digital environment? I don't know how many of you have children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, or play with a neighbor's child. At my stage, I don't have any grandbabies yet. I'm still waiting. But the child is quite old, pushing 40, and it's never going to come, I understand. I can hope. But the reality is that...
No pressure.
Yeah, he's not here. He's not in the room. He's a polymer chemist. We're good. But the reality is this is something that you need to talk to your suppliers about and say, what can you share with me? And what can I give you back, right? So some of us have built things that are in yes, dare I say it, SaaS-based tool, where it's role-based access controlled. You, as a third party, can go in and put your data in. You can get a report. You can understand what some of us might ask of you to remediate what we think is not at the level that you need to be at to play, and then it's yours. Do it once and use it with wild abandon. So at one of my prior companies, I had the privilege of having what I called my first win, which was when the first third party came and said, hey, we went through this experience. I won't use the adjective modifier that they described it with you all. There is something that came out of it that we'd like to showcase. Can we use it with other of our customers? I wanted to do a dance because that's the win. And I've been saying this for years, and I'm going to say it again, and for those of you who know me, yes, it's the same line. If you didn't hear what Erin said, let me repeat it in a different way. We do not live in a world of us and them. We only live in a world of we. If you're not paying attention to the we, you have a problem. And the last piece I think that we're doing is, you're talking about the third parties that you're working with and their third parties, and keep going to at least an exponent of 10 would be my request. It's unreasonable, but we're going to get there. I think you have to flip and start to look at threat intelligence. So thinking about who's working with who as an adversary. There are telltale traits about their exploits. There are techniques that they utilize, and you can start to see alignments, whether it's nation state, particular threat actors who are working together, and I can tell you, they know their supply chains a hell of a lot better than we do. So start to mine the supply chain of threat intelligence to look for alignments and commonalities that will give you a way to say, this is a risk that I want to attack and address first because they're consolidating in this area. And the last piece is beware of data brokers. They are intriguingly out there. I love capitalism. I'm a big fan of it. But the fact that people have figured out that they can resell information that was released in a 1, 2, 3 level threat that was implemented well is really problematic because we're going back to ground zero to figure out whether it's true or not, and you may have already controlled it. So track what you fix.
Yeah.
Right, and-
Oh, I just wanted to hit on that mindset shift. I think for a long time, we've done a lot of work to get on the mindset of the security professional and the defender, and I think that that's critical, right? That's who we are, and it has to be who we are. But now we also have to really think about the mind of the attacker, right? So there is a lot of technology out there, in addition to a lot of expertise out there, that you should be employing and using to your advantage so that you can increase your detection time, your response time, and you can make sure that you're taking the best advantage of what's out there. I think about one of the things, and I used to say this years ago, I used to say, there's going to come a day when security is going to be a market differentiator. And I think with supply chain, this could be a time that might be true, where the people who engage in those processes and who have disclosure and tell you and work with you and show you and tell you what you need to know to help you have confidence in those in what's in their supply chain and what they're using and what's filtering into your supply chain, I think will help in market, in the market. But the other thing I wanted to mention is you're absolutely right. I have top of my notes, it was identity and access management. Those are going to be just key areas for security professionals. And people say, well, how does Mandiant do it? And I thought it was really interesting that I was in with a client meeting one time, and the security professionals were talking about increasing the use of multi-factor authentication in multiple ways. And there was a lot of resistance across the company because, it's going to slow us down, and it's going to be a hassle, and people won't put up with that, and all kinds of things. And I was able to say, look, at Mandiant, we authenticate multiple times, multiple different ways, multiple times every day, day after day after day. And we still somehow figured out how to adapt and get the job done, because while time is money, downtime is more money. Right? That's just where we are in the world today. And I think we have to think about, how long does it take us to take our shoes off and get through the airport, right? At some point, we have to adapt and employ some of the things that are key. Another thing is people say, well, how does Google do it? How do other companies do it, right? And they restrict all the way down to the object level. So I know that people don't like to hear some of these things because I know that the exercise of least privilege is, that principle is really hard for people to want to accept because then it takes time. But at the same time, we're at a point where, because data is so critical, where threat actors are getting access, they're using actual credentials, all of these things that we're talking about make us have to look at these things a little bit differently.
Let me put a plug in for something that's out there that might be useful. So it doesn't have any classified information, but I have the privilege of sitting on a number of public-private efforts, and there was something that was put out a couple of months ago it was jointly by the NSA and by the Department of Homeland Security here in the US, and it was on identity and access management. And I can share that it arose from something that was brought to the attention of some of us that our government colleagues identified as a methodology. And it's a very nice primer that just gives you something that you can always remind yourself about. And if you ever need to face an employee who is asking the question, but I need to have access, you need to always understand why. And what I've said, which, in case you can't tell, I tend to use humor a lot. If you live with anybody in your life, have a significant anybody in your life, I'm going to venture a bet, I've been with my husband for 46 years, that you do not tell them everything. So the principle of least privilege is the same principle you use every day to actually make your life work. People then step back and say, oh, I'm not being left out of something. It's just, yeah, that's a really good point. I love that significant other. And no, I did not tell them about that 2-pound box of chocolates that I just ate alone.
And the
All right,
last
I want to
point,
focus. I want to shift a little bit. We've talked a lot about technology
Yeah.
so far, and that's
Yeah.
very, very important. But we're also seeing a global shifts in the policy landscape as well. And with global supply chains, we need to make sure we can touch upon some of these aspects. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about any of the additional challenges or risks that you're seeing with the increase of data sovereignty, data localization, basically your requirements to store data abroad, and other shifting policy considerations in the landscape, and how those are impacting supply chain security.
So I have a view. I don't know if everybody agrees with it, but my view is that data sovereignty is the antithesis of security. I understand where it came from. I understand its premise is a good premise. But sometimes when regulations are implemented, if you don't do all of the thorough thinking, and that's the reason why public-private partnerships are so valuable, there's a real benefit to thinking comprehensively, because you might be cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? And so it's a challenge, and what it does is it makes things, A, more expensive, B, a little bit more cumbersome, and allows those of us who have the privilege of engaging in those activities to have to get more creative about how we will make sure that data flows. Because there are restrictions in place and you are obligated to honor them. I'm also seeing a set of regulations that people need to be aware of, and security experts may not always be. But right now, the US, Canada, the EU, well, Norway and Germany, the EU is looking at a directive, and there are 3 other countries that are just making noise about it, are looking at forced labor. And they have some remarkable requirements about what you need to prove that you do not have forced labor in your, and by the way, they go to the power of 10. All right, so how you manage those is really intriguing, and how you disclose that. Because again, flip the principle of least privilege. Do you really need to share that with the public? It's sort of like an S-bomb, and there's too many talks on an S-bomb, but Edna Conway on S-bombs. Lots of people on the dark web are really excited about looking at them, because now I know exactly who you use what where. Thank you very much for giving me where I should target first. With all goodness, there's always an attack vector that you need to be aware of. And so I want to encourage you to think about those laws as security problems, because they are part of what is thwarting our ability in some cases, although rarely fully, but thwarting a traditional view, and require you to be at the table with your colleagues to say, if you're going to capture this kind of information, let's put it in this kind of a repository. Let's only share it with X government. Let's lobby the government to say that this should not be publicly available, or that it can be disclosed in a unique way. And I know many companies are doing just that, and actually have set up some repositories that are useful for you to get access to those things.
Great to know. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I don't know if I agree or disagree with your initial premise. I'd have to really think that through. But I will say, though, that I do think this is an area where policies and governance plays a huge role. And I think that how we implement that can be really effective if we think about it, again, from the attacker role. So if you think about data, right, and you were talking about data, where you store it, where it is, who can access it, all those things, think about the data that the threat actors want. They want information about your networks. They want information about your incident response plan, about your defenses, about your security, about your supply chain, about your cyber insurance, right? How many people in your company really need to look at your cyber insurance policy, and how often? To me, if you put some parameters around that and you lock that down, you might be able to predict a ransomware attack before it happens. Because ransomware actors care a lot about whether or not you've got cyber insurance and exactly the limits on those policies. The same is true, they care about your finances, they care about your clients. Client data is being used more and more by threat actors to put pressure on you. They're reaching out to your clients to put pressure on you as a victim. So that client information, that client data is absolutely critical to put those parameters around. And I'll just end with, tips. Like you said, there's resources out there. I can't think of a better time to be at RSA. There is so much innovation going on right now that is really looking at ways to improve upon how do you detect faster, how do we put security parameters in place faster, how do we take human language so that you can talk to technology and have it implement and security practices for you faster. And I think it's absolutely critical that you find out what's out there so that you can use what's best for you.
Great, and actually that is a nice segue into, looking ahead. We heard the notion of we are a we and how to think about that. So I'd like you each to address a little bit some recommendations and thought you have both on perhaps some of the impediments that we're seeing that are probably fairly well known, but maybe the others that are not as well known towards various kinds of perhaps public-private sector for you, other kinds of things you're seeing across third parties for greater collaboration, information sharing, and so forth. And then what opportunities might be out there for companies to build greater operational resilience in this new normal. So maybe, Erin, if you want to kick off what you're seeing in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been working in public-private sector partnerships for most of my career. And I can tell you that the biggest benefit that you get from doing that is that you're leveraging all those authorities and capabilities and reach that you don't have by yourself. I mean, the FBI, for example, is present in over 70 countries around the world. They have relationships around the world. And if you call the FBI, they're going to take the entire body of knowledge that they have and try to give information to you to the best of their ability that can say, oh, this is what you're experiencing. Here's what else we know about it. Here's what else you might be able to find. Here's what I would look for. Here's what might happen next. Here's the timeline. Here's what you could expect. This is probably what you're up against. And here's how you can not only stop what's going on now, but also here's where you can be proactive against what's likely to come next, because we know these threat actors and we know their tactics. That is direct benefit to you. And if you call CISA, you can expect the same type of support because it's a whole of government response, right? A call to one is a call to all. So you get that kind of direct response and direct benefit of the whole body of knowledge because other people are sharing too. The second thing I'll mention is that you get the benefit of having somebody start to look at the root cause and start to have impact against the root cause of the problem. You are really only a symptom of it if you're a victim, and you can only do so much. These threat actors are conducting campaigns that involve actually hundreds of victims. And it will keep happening unless somebody does something about it. So when you engage in that public and private sector engagement, you have that whole ecosystem working together, leveraging all their capabilities, trying to stop it at the root cause. And those things include things like using law enforcement capabilities and authorities to take threat actors off of the infrastructure, or to seize some of the tools, or to dismantle some of the organizations, or to disrupt some of those activities. You're talking about being able to share information that gets to service providers that then can enforce their own user agreements in order to stop some of the activity. It gets the information into the hands of people who have diplomatic reach and capabilities to message, and not just alone, but the coalition of governments that are working together to message through diplomatic channels against a threat actor country or one that's harboring threat actors to actually have impact against the threat. We're sharing information so that it can be used for sanctions or other types of other financial impact against those threat countries or the countries where the threats are emanating from. So it's really about engaging in a process that can get to the root cause.
And Anna, what are you seeing as far as innovative ways for collaboration as well from your angle?
Yeah, I don't know about, let me answer your first question, which was, what are you seeing as impediments? And so I think the biggest impediment is the absence of information sharing. And particularly in democratic societies, information is not shared because of fear of liability, whether it's intentional infliction of economic damage, whether it's breach of contract, whether it's defamation, et cetera. And because we fear the liability, we don't always share. So we have ISAs, we have ISACs, we had the first CISA Act, not the organization. We still don't share information really well. And if you're not at one of the Fortune 10 companies, which is the vast majority of the world, the reality is your information sharing is one level removed because you just don't have the kind of telemetry and access to the information that the larger companies may have. So what I think we need to do is two things. One, build that rapport with the suppliers, right? You can have, I've written many a requirement over many years that talks about you need to alert me if you think, know, speculate, believe, sniff that there might be a problem, whatever words you use.
Absolutely.
Getting the suppliers to do it,
Absolutely.
writing it is not going to do that. This comes down to something that we can't legislate necessarily, and we can't regulate, and we're not going to put in a contract. It comes down to proving that you will partner with your suppliers and that you can trust each other and that you will include others. I do think there's a flip side of this. The flip side of it is, I had the privilege of actually chatting with the former head of NSA, Admiral Mike Rogers, last night, and I said, when are we going to get to the point of giving relief in democratic nations, let's just use the US, with a safe harbor law for information sharing? And it doesn't always have to be security per se. So there's an example that I always use because it was publicly disclosed and it's very, very old now. But imagine that you have electrical connectivity is necessary. We use solder on hardware to make everything flow. That's a fabulous thing. Somebody changed the actual chemical I can say this word, constitution of their actual solder itself, and there's something about red phosphorus that caused a problem. So there was tin whiskering, and guess what? Things were failing. Wouldn't it have been grand if everybody knew that? Because it was fundamental to information and communications hardware at the time. You're talking a good 25 years ago. But that supplier said, we'll handle notifications. And so you honor that out of respect for your supplier, and there was a lot more down failure in connectivity as a result of that, which, by the way, those who sought to attack digitally could take advantage of. So I'll give you those two. Make sure your suppliers know you love them and that they trust you. And number two, think about whether or not we ought to be asking folks to give us a safe harbor law so that we can get the benefit of sharing information, because far too often we believe that there's a secret trove of information that government has, and I'm going to tell you 98% of the time the private sector has the information faster, more thoroughly. We just don't share it as well.
Great, thank you. And we'll take questions in a second, so if you want to start coming up to the microphone. For a last final question, give you two options to choose from. One, that what you were just talking about actually just made me think about, we hear zero trust all over the place right now, and you were really emphasizing trust. So how do we build trust in a zero trust environment would be one. Then just other last thoughts on key takeaways for building operational resilience in this new normal that we're approaching. So start with Erin, if you want to kick
sure.
off.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the last question first.
Yep.
You're good at the first questions. The recommendations, like what are the takeaways, right? I think the first one is, are you able to get threat intelligence to tell you what you need to know fast enough, and do you have the innovation and capabilities in place to actually do something about it? I mean, time and time again, information's out there, but people aren't acting on it, or it takes time. We have examples where we have the threat intelligence and we're taking mitigations for our customers, but we're finding out that the mitigations we're taking are being done prior to the customers even being aware of the threat or problem themselves. I mean, the good news is we're acting on it for them. The downside is it gives us insight that tells us the information flow is not fast enough and people aren't able to react fast enough. And then the second thing is, I know we talked about the basics, but I think it's critical to do the basics well, but do them in a way that demonstrates advancement, right? We're still talking about identity and access management, but we're going to advance that into becoming more sophisticated in how we do that. So it's a matter of advancing those fundamentals and how we do them. And making sure that you are using automation to alert to behaviors that we know the threat actors will take when they're in. Because again, prevention is key. We hope we can prevent all things, but we know we can't. So we want to get to detection, and the only way we can do that is really making sure that we know our environment. We know it was clean at one point in time because we had it checked, and now we know when something anomalous is happening. It's my turn now.
Sorry.
Anomalous is happening, and we can detect that. But there's innovation out there that will help you do that faster. And then the last thing is, I know this is a lot about crisis, but this is a message more about preparation. And when I think about it, I think about when I was in the FBI, and I was actually assigned to Los Angeles for a period of time. We prepared across the state of California in much the same way, whether it was for an earthquake or a physical attack or a cyber attack, because it's the way we exercise those muscles and create muscle memory on how do we handle crisis response, crisis management, because you can't prepare for everything, but you can prepare for almost anything. And I think that if you take that approach, you start to prepare your people, create a bench of leaders, use those tabletop exercises, build your ecosystem, include others and say, okay, who else would I call? Who else would I rely upon? How am I exercising with them so that if I need to pick up the phone and call a supplier or call whoever I need to call to help me, that they're there for me and we know how we would work together, you can exercise that in advance. And I think the last thing is thinking about the government involvement, because not only can you call for assistance from government, but government's moving, right? There's government regulation happening. There's executive orders. There's laws that are being changed. And if you have an interest in the way that that regulation or that law is going to be changed, it might be nice for you to have a voice in that process. And government usually gives you a voice if you're prepared and have the leadership in place to actively engage in that process and have your voice be heard. So if I think about how do you prepare, I think about if you're going to go through something like this and it's a significant attack, you want to do it with people who've done it 1,000 times before.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. So I think that Zero Trust is a way of thinking about technology.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you build trust is the human element. And last time I looked, the digital environment is here to serve us, the humans, not the other way around. So you build trust by the way in which you engage with that ecosystem and what you share with them and the way you listen and the way you avoid penalizing them for, the statement always goes there, but for the grace of God, go I, because they're experiencing something. How about sitting down and partnering with them instead of saying, can you guarantee that it's not going to impact me? It's the wrong approach. Will you get there? Of course you will. Zero Trust is also something that, look, we all play RSA buzzword bingo. I know you all do, right? We're hearing about it a lot. It's a methodology. It's an appropriate frame of mind. But it's been around for a really long time. If you've ever been in a manufacturing facility, for example, or a biopharma facility, there are all kinds of physical gates, and start thinking about the fact that we've been implementing what wasn't called Zero Trust a long time ago, and I would argue is akin to defense in depth in the digital environment. And we need to do it in physical, operational, logical, and information security environments. And I'll give you the last one, behavioral security. Never forget about the human element. Erin said something really intriguing, which is think about anomaly detection. When you combine automated anomaly detection, guess what's looking at for anomalous behavior? A lot of times, user utilization, user activity. Mm-hmm. Then you have the power of technology and deploying techniques to get you to Zero Trust and still making sure that you're letting all of the humans that you work with understand that you trust them and you want them to trust you, but we all need to share information to achieve that goal.
Great, thank you. And I want to give the audience a few minutes. Are there any questions from the audience for Edna or Erin?
I have a question for the audience. Why did you come to this session? What did you want to get out of it? Anybody want to answer that one? Oh God, they're heading for the door.
You know how to clear a room.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for a company that's currently pursuing the FedRAMP authorization. I think that supply chain security and other type of items you discussed, SBOMs, all of that stuff is really important right now in the eyes of the federal government,
Yeah.
especially with cloud providers that the federal government is consuming. And so I was looking forward to hearing
No, thank you for that. And I think, you mentioned the cloud suppliers. I think so many of, particularly the hyperscalers, have information out there to show you, to the extent we can, what certifications we have, what we're doing, and are open to those kinds of questions. I almost encourage it. And when I worked for a large hardware provider, the reality is we would sometimes also go into closed door meetings and say, let me show you what we're finding. And so that's that trust issue. It gives you an ability to say, I really understand my supply chain. That goes a long way, having done many a FedRAMP certification. It goes a long way towards assuring those assessors that you understand, A, what you're doing and how your third parties are actually engaging with you.
Great. Oh, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I'm interested in hearing more about are your thoughts around cross-sector dependencies. So when you think about, you talked a lot about your traditional supply chain. You think about your dependency on telecommunications, your dependency on energy. Obviously, some of the companies are so financial services is obviously an issue for me or what I worry about. But I'm really more interested in thinking a lot about these cross-sector dependencies,
Yeah.
Especially where critical infrastructure is concerned.
Yeah, and just in case for people that may not have heard it, the question is about cross-sector dependencies and both how to address those and concerns.
So let me start that one. Look, I think we're going to get to a point where, DHS has the sector coordinating councils, right? They've identified what's critical. That changes, but a lot of it stays the same. I think we're aware of what they are. I don't know that we have an ability yet to get to true predictive risk. Maybe AI will allow us to get there, where we have to, it's A, information sharing, B, data prediction. And so the way I describe that is a glaring example right now. For anybody who's paying attention to generative AI, it requires the utilization of GPUs in the data center. The GPU is God's gift to energy companies. It is the biggest suck of energy that you've ever seen. If you're not thinking about cross-sector dependencies, you're not thinking about the reality of, are we prepared when we launch this capability to support the amount of energy necessary to facilitate its enablement? And God help us, after everybody is relying on it, the downside of operational cessation because we ran out of the energy. I don't know that there's something yet out there that will give us the best mapping, but we have some tools that are out there doing it. I don't know that any of us are doing it really well, and those of us who are thinking about it, so I have the privilege of sitting on a number of boards, and one of my boards looks at operational resilience. And what we are looking at is a methodology to do that kind of mapping. But it doesn't include, for example, let's stick with energy, walking over to DOE and saying, hey, Sherry, I know you're talking about security, but who do I need to talk to at FERC or NERC to think about capacity building and moving flow, and more importantly, how many people, when they're building a data center, small or multifaceted hyperscalers, actually go and talk to the local departments. I actually asked this question. You'd be amazed how few.
All right. And Aaron, final word for you.
I think that there are some structures in place, and I think that it's going to take two-way engagement, right? So we mentioned one of those right now, and we think about those sector coordinating councils. We think about some of these bodies that are in place for the critical infrastructure, and I think about it a lot because I really care about the national security. I've been a national security professional for most of my life now, and so I do think about how do we get more resilient as a nation, and those same practices will flow down into other things. And when I think about it, I think about the two-way engagement, and the reason I'm saying this is because the sector's council was mentioned, and while it's true, some of the companies that have an interest in one area should be engaging in those questions, but also that's a forum for those companies that are at that council to say, hey, I'm concerned about some of these things without necessarily waiting for government to be the driver, right? Government is a driver in a lot of those, but they don't have to be the only driver. There's plenty of room for those companies that run those utilities and everything else that we rely upon who could say, well, here's what I'm concerned about. Can I put that into the council for conversation? And I think that that's where we can start to get into some of these issues.
Erin, you just made the case for resurrection of stronger and more active cross-sector coordination,
Yeah.
because we had one.
Yep.
We had a cross-sector coordinating council, and it's been aging and moving a little bit more slowly than it should.
And unfortunately, we're at time, but feel free to come up and
Feel free, yeah.
we can ask questions. I think we need to exit the room, though. Is that?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for all.
Thank you.